Thank you very much. I want to thank Kofi Annan and the Forum and Martin Frick and others for allowing this topic to be put on the table. However, I think you'll see that it's not here simply as a random synonym for connectivity or networking and so on, which is the way we usually use it, but I have been trying to raise it now for the last 10 years in a variety of forums because I think it goes to the heart of why we are failing and are likely to fail in making any genuine progress on climate change. The term can be taken simply to talk about the interconnectivity of the ecological world we live in, and there are obvious ways in which that interconnectivity are often not seen. Wind turbines kill birds, dams kill salmon. They're both energy alternative ways of producing non-fossil fuel, but they have their own problems. We got rid of DDT, more mosquitoes, more disease. The silicon with which we make our photoelectric cells is expensive when it's used in countries like the United States and Europe. In northern climes, it's not very efficient. The price of silicon goes up, and then people in southern climes who can use it much more efficiently find themselves priced out of the market. So those are kind of aspects that we're more familiar with of the interconnectivity of the ecological realm. But I want to talk specifically about interdependence because of another term that comes with it, and it's why we can't simply use it as a synonym for interconnectivity or other forms of codependency. Because I want to suggest that the built-in interdependence of the ecological paradigm runs squarely up against the profoundly significant and dominant paradigm of the last 400 years, and that paradigm still dominates and is likely to dominate unless we face it squarely. That paradigm is not the paradigm of interdependence, but the paradigm of independence. I want to talk a little bit about independence and suggest why it makes programs of interdependence, like the ecological program, so very problematic. I believe that Kyoto stumbled on, and Copenhagen is likely to stumble on, the paradigm of independence. That's going to be finally what makes it very difficult to do what is otherwise self-evident and obvious. I mean, one of the problems with this discussion is we go around the halls and everybody's saying the same thing. Can't they see? Don't they understand? The end is nigh. We haven't got much time. And all of that's true. And yet you either have to think human beings incredibly perverse and self-destructive, which is a pretty good hypothesis on the one hand, but not necessarily the most important one, because the other possibility is that there are another set of values that we cherish, that are rooted in our history, that stand in the way of the paradigm of interdependence, which comes naturally out of ecology and the attempts to curb climate change. And let me just briefly look at three aspects of the interdependent paradigm as it fails to address the independence paradigm, which I believe is still dominant. But because it's absent in our discussion, we all talk about interconnectivity and interdependence. We don't talk about the paradigm that is standing there. It also allows us to talk about the good and bad, the smart and the stupid. We're the good, we get it. They're the bad, they don't. We're smart, we understand it. They're dumb, they don't understand it. And frankly, that's always a poor way to succeed, to underrate the intelligence and virtue of your adversaries. Because one of the problems is the adversaries here have more than just industrial greed or selfishness or malice or exploitation on their mind. So let me just quickly talk about three kinds of independence which are a primary obstacle to interdependence, and why, for me, we have to stop talking just about ecology and start looking at a paradigm of interdependence for its own sake, which I think will be necessary for the success of the environmental movement, which in a certain sense has been stagnant for the last 20, 30, or 40 years since people discovered, oh my gosh, human beings affect their environment in ways that are dangerous to human beings, and oh my God, we're on a path to doomsday, that if we don't get going, something's going to happen. We've been hearing that message for 30 or 40 years, and I hear exactly the same message here. I have the virtue or vice of being somewhat older than I look, and I've been around for a long time here. I was in graduate school in the very early 1960s, studying political theory and political science, and I've been hearing this message all the way back to Silent Spring, all the way back to the Club of Rome in 70. We all remember the Club of Rome's notion of the lily pond. You know, first it's only 128th covered with lilies, then 164th is covered with lilies, 128th, 116th, 1/8, 1/2, and then all at once, one more change, and the lily pond's full. And that's kind of the CO2 paradigm that we follow as well. And those warnings have been around for a long time, and so little has happened. And let me tell you why I think that's the case, and what we have to focus on, therefore, in the run-up to Copenhagen and afterwards, if there is going to be success. We have to stop talking simply about, if only you knew, if only you understood. The world's businessmen, the world's politicians understand. They have heard the message, but they are still marching to a different drum, and it's not the drum of greed, and it's not the drum of stupidity. We start with the paradigm of domain or sector independence. The fact is, we have organized our professional associations, our universities, our epistemological systems around distinctive, discrete bodies of knowledge: economics, psychology, culture, politics. We can go on naming them. And each of them is not only an insulated domain that brings its own methodologies and its own approach, but much more importantly, brings its own concerns and values, each of which are important and valuable. Not something we can say, oh, those stupid economists, they don't get it. They get it. For 300 years, economists have studied civilization and come to the correct conclusion that growth, productivity, capital accumulation, the use of labor power to transform the environment, and the use of machines to transform labor, they've come to the conclusion that all of those things have moved the human race not from wonderful nature to some stupid, clumsy artifice, but from backwardness, from ignorance, from child mortality, from disease, to a civilization capable of sustaining millions of people into old age, moved away from, again, the natural paradigm. The natural paradigm was a paradigm, you want to remember, in which women had 5 to 7 children in order that 2 could grow up. That was not a paradigm of happiness, although some people seem to think that's what it is. And today, in developed countries, people have 2.1 children so that they can have 2 grow up and replace themselves. And actually, they're so efficient at it that they're not even replacing themselves. And the human population is going down, which from some points of view ought to be good in terms of population pressure. Not very good from the economic paradigm, where growth is what's important. So growth, productivity, even consumption have a real value and are important. And from the perspective of the domain of the economists count, and we sit around blaming economists in India and China and Brazil and Russia from wanting to imitate a paradigm which brought us in the West remarkable success, but now, because it has other costs and other domains, we wanted to deny to them. And they're both puzzled and feel a certain kind of injustice. They're understandably so, because we're denying them a paradigm, and now we're pretending the paradigm's rotten. You know, we spent 300 or 400 years becoming the civilization that we are, and I don't mean civilization in terms of its culture things. I mean civilization in terms of medicine, in terms of longevity, in terms of child mortality, and so on. And others are mimicking that, but they're doing it from the paradigm of economics. You go to psychology, where the issue is not growth, but as we've seen in some psychologists who talk about this, it's happiness. A very different thing. Happiness and growth, they're related, sometimes in positive, sometimes in negative ways, but happiness is quite different, and psychologists are concerned with happiness. Some people have noticed that finally some economists have escaped their domain silo and begun to do what they call behavioral economics, in which happiness becomes an economic factor, a metric that you try to measure. But that's actually an attempt to do a hybrid between psychology and economics, and it hasn't really caught on very well, and the people who represent it, they've been around for 20 or 30 years, but they don't feel they're being much heard. But that's because we stay in our domains in growth and productivity and consumption.